Good evening, everyone. I'm Chris Borick, and on behalf of the Muhlenberg College Institute of Public Opinion and Keep Our Republic, I'd like to welcome you to our forum tonight, Democracy in Crisis, Elections in 2020. In 2016, President Trump won the presidential election in Pennsylvania by less than 1%. And with Election Day only 41 days away, Pennsylvania is once again one of the most hotly contested states in the 2020 race. Add in a historic pandemic, changes in voting procedures, threats of foreign interference in the election, and you can understand the unease that surrounds this year's election. So this is the perfect time to gain understanding into the various aspects of maintaining election integrity in 2020. And I hope tonight's panel discussion is one of many forums that provides insight and perspective into this important and momentous time in our republic. I'm honored to have an outstanding panel join me tonight in a conversation about an election integrity in Pennsylvania and beyond. So let me introduce our panelists, and we'll do this alphabetically. First, Dick Gephardt. Dick Gephardt is president and CEO of Gephardt Government Affairs. Mr. Gephardt served for 28 years in the United States House of Representatives, representing Missouri's 3rd Congressional District, home to his birthplace, St. Louis. He was elected to serve as House Democratic leader for more than 14 years, as House Majority Leader from 1989 to 1995, and as Minority Leader from 1995 to 2003. Dick began his career in public service in 1968 as a precinct captain in his hometown of St. Louis in the 14th Ward, and from 1971 to 1976 served as its alderman. Mr. Gephardt earned his Bachelor of Science degree from Northwestern University and a Juris Doctorate from the University of Michigan Law School. Welcome, Dick.
Great to be here.
Next, Mary McCord. Mary McCord serves as Legal Director at the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection and as a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. Mary was the acting Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the U.S. Department of Justice from 2016 to 2017, and Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the National Security Division from 2014 to 2016. Previously, Mary was an Assistant U.S. Attorney for nearly 20 years at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. Mary graduated from Georgetown University Law School and served as a law clerk for Judge Thomas Hogan of the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you. It's good to be here tonight.
And finally, David Thornburgh. David Thornburgh is president and CEO of the Committee of 70. He came to the Committee of 70 in 2014 from the University of Pennsylvania's Fels Institute of Government, where he had served as executive director since 2008. Prior to Fels, David served as CEO of the Alliance for Regional Stewardship and as executive director of the Economy League of Greater Philadelphia. From 1988 to 1994, he served as director of the Wharton Small Business Development Center, and before that, as director of civic affairs at the Cigna Corporation in Philadelphia. David holds a BA in political science from Haverford College and a master's degree of public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Chris.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me. And we're going to go right into the discussion. I'd like to have some opening thoughts from the three of you on the unique challenges that are facing the integrity of the 2020 election. As I mentioned before, we're in this very unique moment in history. We're in a place like Pennsylvania that seems to be at the center of it. So before we get into more specifics, I'd just like to hear your thoughts on where you see this moment. And we'll turn to you first, David, as a Pennsylvanian, in reverse order from alphabetical introductions.
Sure. And I've got 3 things on my list. I also want to point out the Volkswagen in back of me, which is the sort of corporate car of the Committee of 70, which is a nonpartisan advocate for better government. So here's the 3 things on my list. One is the election administration challenge. Like a lot of states, Pennsylvania is trying to run 2 parallel elections that it's never done before at the same time, a mail election and an in-person election. And they're just enormous stresses and strains. The second thing, and related to that, is the challenge of educating voters about these new options and new opportunities. Again, we've got maybe 10 or 15 times as many people likely to vote by mail as has ever voted before. And there's a process and procedures and rules, and we can talk about naked ballots, which has gotten a lot of attention, but huge challenge there. And then the final one, I would put under the general category of misinformation, which shows up in all forms. But frankly, also, I'm increasingly anxious about how misinformation will affect what some folks are calling the interregnum, which is the period between November 3rd and December 14th. But more on that later, I suspect. But that's my list of three to throw out the first pitch.
Thank you so much, David. We'll turn to you, Mary.
Yeah, I'll just start really where David left off, which is I think that one of the biggest challenges is just to ensure voters have confidence in the legitimacy and the validity of our election processes against a backdrop of constant misinformation and disinformation. And it's the type of disinformation that, along with other things that have been happening in the past year, really more than year, have contributed to the dramatic polarization that we're seeing in the country right now. And that polarization, I think, is also being seeded by this disinformation. The notion right now that mail-in ballots are subject to heightened possibility of fraud. The notion that delay in counting ballots, which is almost inevitable that there will be delays because of so many mail-in ballots, that delay equals fraud. This seeding by those who would deal in disinformation of doubts about the legitimacy of the election, which then fuels more polarization and, frankly, and I hate to really say it, but the potential for political violence surrounding the elections and in that post-election period. And so it really is going to take strong leadership and strong statements and trust in the validity of the processes, which so many people are working so hard on right now to ensure that people will not feel like there's anything they need to take to the streets about. And so that's one of the things I see as the biggest challenge.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary. And finally, Dick.
Sure. So I got to start with a little bit of my experience. So I've always felt that politics or democracy, whichever word you want to use, is a substitute for violence. It really is. And we could see violence or politics not being a valid substitute this year because of the polarization of our people, because of the pandemic causing a longer time to count the ballots when people will be very upset and suspicious that bad things are happening. And, this will be the toughest election to bring off successfully, maybe in the history of the country. I just want to add one more word about violence. I had 28 years in the House, as leader of the Democrats for about half that time. I saw a lot of big controversial votes. I mean, really controversial votes, where both sides were really upset, really bitter, really anxious, really emotional that they win. But what happened in every case, when the vote was finally taken, the losing side was willing to grudgingly accept the result. I came to be in awe of that. Mm-hmm. Tell people all the time, I'm in awe of what we do in this country. Our ancestors wanted us to have 535 people in the room, not one. And that means every issue has to be voted on and debated and decided, and you hope that the losing side grudgingly accepts the result, even though they hate the result. Right now, we have a polarized country into this election, and you've got all the misinformation that's going back and forth. Both sides suspect that the other side is cheating already. And so my great worry is that whoever comes out finally, if we can even count the votes, the winner, the other side is not going to be willing to accept the result. And you already have President Trump has been saying for months, if he loses, it's rigged. Pulling this off successfully is going to be yeoman work, but I'm confident that we can do it. We've done it in other times of national crises, Civil War, World War I, World War II. And so that's why I've been trying to bring together bipartisan groups of former federal officials, like Keep Our Republic, to really help try to land this plane on November 3rd or November 15th, whenever the counting is done.
Thank you so much, Congressman. I was watching a PBS documentary on Ronald Reagan this week in The American Experience. I'm sure folks have seen it over the years. And there was a moment with your old colleague, Tip O'Neill, after the Republican victories and the phone call between him and the president. And the moment when Tip O'Neill says, "You whipped us good, Mr. President," you know, and the way he said that, it just struck me in this moment, how long ago that seemed historically, but you could certainly relate. So we'll turn to some of the aspects of the 2020 election. I'm going to let Mary lead off with this one. Mary, mail voting has become a center of the discussion, a center of a lot of the debates in this process. Certainly, as David alluded to before, it's going to play a bigger role in Pennsylvania, which has historically never had large-scale mail-in voting, just absentee balloting. What, if any, concerns do you have about the prevalence of mail-in ballots and mail as part of the election process in 2020?
So I don't have any concerns about, things like fraud or things of that nature. I mean, there are many states, particularly our Western states, that have used mail-in voting for years, and in fact have used a process by which, if the votes are in by election day, they can be counted for some period thereafter. And that, of course, was also what the Pennsylvania Supreme Court recently ruled in its ruling about mail-in voting in Pennsylvania. And that's what may or may not be headed to the US Supreme Court. But that has worked effectively in many states for many years. What's new this year, of course, is that so many more states are doing it for the first time. And so they don't have the same experience. They don't have the same track record of being able to quickly get through these votes and get results posted. And still, even in those Western states, we're not necessarily always talking about the day of the election, because there are votes that remain to be counted for several days thereafter. Of course, we have concerns about the Postal Service and deliveries because of the delays that we've been experiencing. There's ongoing litigation, as you are probably aware, challenging some of the changes that the Postmaster DeJoy announced with respect to the Postal Service, including, ending overtime and taking down certain mail sorting machines and other things that have contributed to delays over the last several months. And so even though there are some court orders right now that have been issued that enjoin that is still in active litigation. The U.S. government, as it so often does, is likely to move for a stay of that injunctive relief, and it will probably be still tied up in litigation when we get to the time of the election. So I think voters right now are feeling a little bit nervous that their mail-in ballot will actually get to their voting places on time. And so I'm glad to see that many jurisdictions are creating drop boxes for these ballots. In Virginia, where I live, even if you ask for a mail-in ballot, if you decide to go in person, you sign an affidavit that you are not going to turn in your mail-in ballot. And of course, they have records anyway of your vote. And if you tried to turn in a mail-in ballot, they would see that you were trying to vote twice. So there are procedures that can be implemented to not only ensure against fraud, but also to help ensure that even with Postal Service delays, there will be other means of being able to get your ballot in on time. I am concerned about some of the rules out of Pennsylvania that prohibit things like, drivers accumulating ballots to bring the ballot boxes, because as we all know, there are people in our communities, particularly during a pandemic, who either aren't mobile or they're immunocompromised, or they're just not able to get out and physically deliver these ballots. And so, it pains me to see that things that I don't feel like anybody, no matter what your politics are, ought to be arguing about, which is the ability to ensure that your ballot that you have filled out in accordance with the directions and the law would not be counted. And so hopefully these challenges can be overcome.
Great, thanks, Mary. David, you're in Philadelphia, which is at the center of a lot of the recent discussion about mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania and beyond. How about your perspective on broader the role of mail-in ballots and any concerns you might have with this cycle?
Sure. Well, I tell you this, I am more concerned about the misinformation and disinformation about mail balloting and voting by mail than I am by the reality of voting by mail. I mean, it is an enormous stress on the system, and it's a very fragile system. I don't think we quite appreciate that. But look, I also have faith in the 67 counties of Pennsylvania and the men and women who are working, probably even now, almost day and night, to make this happen. And, you know, I did my time, maybe all of you have done your time working the polls, and it's not glorious work, but I think that the folks that make elections run are some of the best true civic-minded public citizens that we could ask for. They're not partisan operatives. They're just trying to do a good job for their communities and to make sure that they deliver as best they can, you know, in and around election day. So I have faith in that system. And any errors that are going to happen are going to be human errors. Again, it's not some dark partisan operatives sitting behind the curtain manipulating the controls. We just have to keep reminding folks that. And also around misinformation, I keep saying to folks, if you have concerns, talk to your local officials, because they're actually the ones that run this. And frankly, if you haven't worked in this business before, I think you almost don't have the ability to opine on what's going on or what's not going on. So it's going to be rough, but ultimately I have faith that we'll be able to deliver.
Thank you, David. Congressman Gephardt, thoughts on the role that mail will play, mail-in ballots in this cycle, and any concerns that you may have about that role?
Well, I think Mary probably said earlier that there's going to be a huge higher volume of mail-in ballots for the reason of the pandemic. People don't want to go stand in line and subject themselves to the virus. So I'm hearing estimates, and if you look at the primary that you had in Pennsylvania a few weeks ago, you saw a huge higher volume, but that is nothing compared to what you're going to see in this election when you have higher turnout anyway. So this is an enormous challenge, but I want to reiterate what David just said. We've got to assure Americans that we can do this, that we should have confidence that we can do this in Pennsylvania and everywhere. And I want to reiterate what he said about the people that are the election officials, many of them volunteers that are going to spend inordinate time and even subjecting themselves to the possible getting of the virus to do this job. We have a group of 31 former public servants, federal public servants, half of them Republican, half of them Democrat. And we've raised $12 million, and we're going to put ads starting October the 8th in 3 states. One of them is Pennsylvania. And the whole purpose of the ads is to give people confidence that we can pull this election off. We can count these votes. Every vote can be counted accurately and fairly, and we can figure out who won the election in Pennsylvania and everywhere else. And I'll just say one additional thing. When I said a minute ago that in the House, people were willing to have grudging acceptance of the outcome, even though they didn't like it. The reason they had that acceptance was they felt the process was fair. And that's what we have to get across to people in this election period. This is a fair process. The disinformation, the misinformation is wrong. And you can vote for whoever you want. but we can do this. We don't have to even think for a moment that we can't pull off an election in this 240-year-old democracy.
Hey, Chris, let me just jump in because we've sort of alluded to it, but I think we need to put it on the table. Many folks have said election day is not going to be election day. It's going to be election week. So we're going to have to, and we should take our time to count the ballots. And this fantasy that somehow the election is over at 8:05 on November 3rd, somebody said is like at the end of the third quarter of the football game saying, it's over now. That's just not right. And we have to condition ourselves to know that this is going to take some time, but it's going to take some time because we want to get it right.
And David, our ads are going to stress two messages. One is that it's not going to probably be over on election night. So we all have to be patient and wait for the results, wait for every vote to be counted. And we also have to reject violence and disruption. We have to give these election officials the time that they need to do their job and to count every vote.
You know, I'll just follow up on that before we turn to some other subjects. Patience, right? We're asking for patience. It seems that patience is at a premium right now in American life and in our world. Are there ways to try and convince the public, or as you just mentioned, Dick, maybe ads and other things, but are we able to be patient, and especially with some voices that might not be encouraging patience at this time? I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Well, we're recruiting former members of Congress from all states, especially the big swing states that are going to be so difficult. And we're going to put them on the air. We've got 4 of the last Department of Homeland Security officials, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. They're going to be doing media, earned media in states like Pennsylvania. And we have when we ask these people to be in this group, a National Council for Election Integrity, we told them we're going to ask you to do a lot of interviews. We're going to ask you to get on TV and local TV stations and radio stations and get this message out. So we can't just count on paid media. That's fine. But we need trusted voices out there talking to the public about being patient, rejecting violence, and giving them confidence that we can do this and get it done right.
I couldn't agree more, Chris. And I think have folks like Dick Gephardt to stand up and say much of what he said tonight is hugely important. You know, my pitch as well is to try to plant in people's heads, again, the pictures of the men and women who are actually carrying this out. These are the people that you see on the street walking their dogs, that live next door to you, that you worship with. These are just average, everyday folks. Again, I think just terrific public servants. So my theory, we're all trying out our own theories, is if we can plant and reinforce that image in people's heads, that can go a long way to giving them the kind of confidence that we need.
Mary.
Yeah, I also think we have to recognize the power of social media. I mean, we've been talking a lot about disinformation, and the primary method for spreading disinformation is through social media. And we need to be asking more of, demanding more really, as consumers from our social media platforms and our other communications platforms to be, and we have definitely seen changes in this regard over the last several months, labeling things that appear to be not based in fact, that appear to be misinformation and disinformation, and perhaps even be more aggressive than that. You know, when I was in National Security, the Department of Justice, during the time when ISIS declared a caliphate in Syria, they used social media to proselytize and to recruit and to radicalize people to tremendous effect. And I'm not suggesting that the disinformation about the elections is the same as terrorist disinformation, but the ubiquity and the widespread use of social media allowed them to really attract a lot of foreign terrorist fighters and allowed them to take physical property in Syria and Iraq and provide a great threat to the US. And we had attacks here in the homeland on behalf of ISIS. And it took social media quite a while. I was meeting with people back then. They're well-minded people who never developed their platforms in order to promote terrorism or to promote disinformation or Russian interference in our elections, for example, yet their platforms ended up being used that way. And they were really too slow to kind of like catch on to that and take measures. They were woefully understaffed several years ago in terms of their own monitoring of their content and taking down things that were not, that were violence, encouraging violence, threatening violence, disinformation, provably false information. Like I say, they are getting more aggressive there, but people need to demand this. Consumers of social media really need to, it's a for-profit company, and they will answer to what their consumers want, and consumers need to reject disinformation, including as it relates to the election. And to the extent that people may think, well, what about the First Amendment? The social media companies are private companies. They are not bound like the government to not engage in viewpoint discrimination. They are not bound by the First Amendment. Now, of course, they respect the principles that the First Amendment stands for. That's why they have platforms that allow for free speech. I do a lot of First Amendment work in my current litigation. I'm a huge believer in freedom of speech, but they are not bound by the same rules that the government is bound by. They could take down any content that they want to take down, and they will take it down if they think that consumers demand it from them because it hits them in their bottom line. So I think that we can't ever ignore the impact of that type of disinformation about mail-in voting, about delay, etc. And the fact that social media could play a very positive role in reinforcing the points that the Congressman and David have made tonight about the fact that mail-in voting is not fraudulent. There's no empirical evidence to support that. Delay does not mean fraud. They can elevate those kind of things. Their algorithms can elevate that kind of rhetoric so that people don't get in a rabbit hole of hearing the same disinformation. So, I think that it's important to keep that in mind and important to continue the pressure on those companies to do the right thing.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary. Thanks to all. I'm going to turn our attention a little bit to the courts. Congressman Gephardt, you spent your career largely in the legislative branch in Washington. Even in the best of times, the courts have a role in elections and certification of elections and elections processes and concerns. What role do you think the courts will most likely play in the 2020 election?
Well, I think if you look around the country, they're already playing a role. I think you're seeing that in Pennsylvania with the recent cases that have been decided. I'm told that there are over 300 cases around the country that have been filed on various aspects of this election. Mary may have a much better handle on it than I do. So they're already involved. And if you look back at the year 2000, you saw the Supreme Court had a major role in that situation, but where there was a tied election between Al Gore and George W. Bush. I hope that after the election, there isn't a huge involvement of the courts, because if there is, it's going to really add to the upset all over the country. We at Keep Our Republic, we are looking at all the various avenues of problems that can happen after the election. For instance, what if it's taking weeks and weeks to count the votes in Pennsylvania? Let's take that hypothetical. And then everybody gets exasperated in the state, and then the state legislature, which is run by the Republican Party, decides they're never going to get this done. We got to send the electors that won on the machines. And you could have people on the night of the election saying, let's forget those mail-in ballots. They're fraudulent. So we just got to go with what happened on the machines on election day. And then if the legislature, and incidentally in 2000, the Florida legislature was about to send the slate of electors for George W. Bush because they were controlled by the Republicans. They were cut off by what the Supreme Court did. But that's where you could be again. And we understand that under the various Amendment 12, I think it is, and the Electoral Count Act, There's all kinds of language there. Some of it's not very precise. So the governor could send in his slate of electors, and then it all goes to Congress. Will be hanging off the ceiling by that time, and God knows what they do with that, and who wins the Senate. I mean, you get into a million questions. So my hope, you've already got the courts. That's my first answer. But I hope that we can get this done speedily, and we won't get into all those rabbit holes that we could go in if it's really close and takes a very long time to count the votes.
I'm with Dick in hoping that we don't get into this litigation frenzy at the end of the day, and we still have time. And our organization is spending a lot of time both working with local election officials here in Philadelphia to do everything we can to get it right, get the process of running the election right, and then working with them to educate voters. Because if the fewer voters who are mystified by the mail-in voting process in particular, who follow the rules. I mentioned this naked ballot, which is, we've got a secrecy ballot and then a secrecy envelope and then an outer envelope, and you have to put both of them in order to have your vote count. The more folks that pay attention to that and get it right, I think it lessens the vulnerability, sort of the cracks in the system that the litigators and the legal sharks essentially could exploit. So that's my hope. We have 41 days, as you said, Chris, and we've got a lot of work to do in that respect.
Quick follow-up on that, David. The question of the ballots without being properly sealed or put in the envelope without the protective ballot from the primary election. Do you think that was the product of poor kind of education and training on the part of the folks that were dealing with that? What do you think led to the numbers that we saw?
Well, just the 10-fold, 15-fold increase in the people voting like this for the first time. And, it seems a little odd that you'd have all these envelopes that you'd have to assemble. So I think it's just, but again, to my mind, and, I know this is sort of wishful thinking, like the tie ought to go to the voter. I mean, these are people who just sat down, tried to do what they did. They missed one step. The court has now said, well, guess what? That's an important step. So tough luck. But so now we've just got to go back to people again and again and again. And that's a lot of what we're doing right now. Just making sure people, lots of clever ways of, putting the fig leaf on the naked ballot and making sure that it ends up being counted.
That's great. Mary, I'll turn back the kind of the broad question, and obviously you'll have great insight on this. On the courts, where do you see them likely to be playing a role in this election, and any concerns or thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, the Congressman has laid out sort of some of the vagaries in the Election Count Act and some of the other procedures that typically, go by without a lot of controversy, although we obviously had controversy in 2000. There's certain dates for states to take advantage of what are called safe harbor provisions. And if they've resolved their slate of electors by that date, then that slate gets passed forward. If they miss that date, it can be challenged. And there's a lot. It's the Electoral Count Act is like one very, very long sentence that is incredibly difficult to discern. And so anytime in law you have an incredibly long sentence with lots of internal clauses, that gives lawyers lots of ability to find ways to challenge it. So I am like the Congressman and hoping we won't get to that type of litigation. I think we're going to continue to see the type of litigation that we're already seeing. I think we may see litigation over the ways that ballots are rejected. People should have an opportunity to remedy any defect in their ballot without just having it thrown out. So whether that means you didn't put it in the right series of envelopes, or whether someone has challenged your signature, mind you, someone who is not a signature expert, a handwriting expert, but just a poll worker thinking, oh, that doesn't look quite right. Voters ought to have the opportunity to remedy any perceived defects in their ballots to make sure their votes can be counted. And so I think we could potentially see litigation over that. There are voter challenger laws in many states that allow, in some cases, pretty much anyone to challenge the right of someone else to vote, which can be used in a very discriminatory way and a way that leads to intimidation and voter suppression. There are other types of voter intimidation that hopefully will get resolved short of litigation, but could involve litigation. My organization just last week, we put out fact sheets for all 50 states that are available, and I can make them available to your viewers, that advise voters and local officials and state officials about what they can do if they see armed groups of individuals near the polling sites. Unfortunately, in the last several months, really several years, but certainly even greater in the last several months, we've seen armed, unauthorized, unlawful private militias deploying ostensibly to protect property and protect public safety in the face of oftentimes false rumors about violent anarchists coming to their towns in connection with racial justice protests. These private unauthorized groups are acting wholly outside of any authority. They are not authorized to engage in that type of activity. The Second Amendment does not protect their activity, and I can talk more about that later if people want to. But I worry about some of these groups because of the rhetoric out there about fraud, thinking, well, we need to deploy armed to the polls to protect the legitimacy of the election, to protect against people voting, I don't know, twice, or who are unqualified, or whatever they may think that they are worried about based on the disinformation out there. And the effect that would have would be intimidation. And so things like that could be the basis for lawsuits to prevent that type of activity, to enjoin that type of activity. In the states that have started early voting, there's a little bit of a trial run to, I think, see what kind of things are going to happen outside the polls. And there's other restrictions. Intimidation is illegal in all 50 states, as well as under federal law. But there are also limits on how close you can electioneer near polling places and things like that. And in this polarized environment, with the disinformation we see, I am worried about voter intimidation. And like I said, there are other ways to combat that, but one of those could also be litigation. So I'm hopeful we won't be litigating the results, but I do think there will continue to be litigation about the process.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary. Very insightful. Just turn to you for a second, David. Obviously, Philadelphia, I keep putting you on the spot as the voice of Philadelphia. But this issue, right, has been raised a number of times, right, about people and outside parties coming into the city, perhaps, around election to do some of the things that Mary has just discussed. Any thoughts or elaboration on that?
Well, I believe the Supreme Court decision, the state Supreme Court decision just came down, prevented poll watchers from other counties in basically jumping in their cars and driving to another county to watch polls. So that's one sort of possibility that can happen. I'm going to go back to the example that Dick Gephardt raised. I think if that looms as more and more possible, this is the time for people of goodwill and integrity and experience in as public servants to stand up and say, can't do that. Just can't do that. And maybe that's a somewhat naive belief, but we've got to draw on, as Dick Gephardt said at the outset, this legacy of peaceful, if grudging, transitions in this country, and we've got to get people to stand up and demonstrate that violence and intimidation is just not acceptable. That's just not what we do in this country.
Great.
And
go ahead. Yeah,
Chris, my great worry is also, Mary brought up the problems during the election period. I'm also very worried about the period after the election, again, because it's going to take a long time to count the votes. And my worry is if one side or the other, or both sides, hits the bricks, it could happen. After the election, if one side hits the bricks, the other side will hit the bricks. And then you're into confrontation and possible violence. And all of us have to really be talking to the public in states like Pennsylvania, which is going to be closely divided, I'm sure, in this election, that people have to stand down. They have to reject. Now, people can protest peacefully. They have the right to do that. You can't stop them, and you shouldn't. But it can't turn into violence. We can't substitute violence for democracy, which is what we would be doing. Mm-hmm. It would just be tragic if we allow that to happen. So that's a moment of great danger, and all of us have to be on microphones wherever we can, talking to the public calmly, patiently, and arguing that they should be patient.
Let me turn, we have been discussing a little bit about the potential and hopefully not of any political violence. Mary, you've done a lot of work on that area and research. So maybe this is a good opportunity if you just wanted to share any thoughts kind of from a broader perspective on that issue itself.
Sure. And, I've done a lot, partly because of my prior work with extremism and terrorism. I've spent a lot of time, even since I've been out of government, focusing on the domestic extremism problem that we have. And domestic is really kind of a misnomer, because some of our problems of extremism, whether it's white supremacy or whether it's extremism, Islamist extremism or other forms of extremism, they don't stop at the US borders. These are international problems, and we've seen more and more, even when extremism gets driven to the point of violence and terrorism, we're seeing, for example, white supremacist-based terrorism occurring, across the world, the globe, with terrorists referring to the actions of each other when they commit their terrorist attacks. We saw that from the El Paso shooter and Christchurch, New Zealand, and others. Terrorism, of course, is a far cry from what we're talking about here, but there is a continuum of radicalization toward violence from people who harbor extremist views. And some of the concerns that I have, and I think that Gephardt and others have, about political violence in the US, it will be driven by some of the extremist views, exacerbated by disinformation and by the ubiquity of guns in this country and the mythology around the Second Amendment. There are many, many people that actually believe that it is lawful for armed private militias to deploy into towns and ostensibly protect property. I saw footage coming out of Louisville today of armed private militias walking down the street with their AR-15s. We are talking about assault rifles. They were in full camouflage gear with bulletproof vests, combat boots, helmets, etc. The normal person would think they might be the National Guard, but they're not. They're not answerable to governmental authority like the National Guard is. They're answerable only to themselves, and they're unlawful. And, people say to me, what about the word militia in the Second Amendment? What about the word militia in state constitutions? Well, militia is defined in federal law and state law is that body of able-bodied residents between, usually it's ages of 17 or 18 and 45 or so, that are available for the government to call forth in defense of the state. But only the government. In the states, it's the governor. In the federal government, it's Congress, then reportable through the president and through the statutes that Congress has enacted, but only in service of the government, not in service of their own desires about when they would think that they would want to deploy. And so all 50 states actually have provisions in their state laws, either their state constitutions or state criminal laws or other laws that prohibit private, unauthorized paramilitary activity. And the Supreme Court there's a lot of things about the Second Amendment that are gray areas, a lot of things the Supreme Court has never answered about what types of restrictions on what types of guns might be had, what other types of restrictions might be constitutional. But the one thing that the Supreme Court has been very, very clear about is that the Second Amendment does not prevent states from prohibiting private paramilitary activity. They first held that in 1886 in upholding a state statute that 29 states have today on the books, which prohibits bodies of men from associating as military units or parading or drilling in public with firearms. That statute was challenged on First and Second Amendment grounds back in 1886. The Supreme Court upheld that against those challenges and again said the Second Amendment doesn't protect that activity. 2008, in District of Columbia versus Heller, probably the most significant Second Amendment case for many, many, many decades, upheld the same principle in holding that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to bear arms for one's own individual self-protection. They contrasted that with what it does not protect, and again reiterated the holding from 1886 that it does not protect private paramilitary organizations. So this notion that it is okay to deploy with your guns, whether it's to protect the polls or after an election to, offensively try to, protect one candidate or the other, or ensure that one candidate or the other is the one who gets seated by creating their own private armies. This is illegal. It's illegal under federal law. It's illegal under state law. And that people need to understand that, because there's just so much misunderstanding, even among our law enforcement, about what kind of activity is lawful. So I'm sort of on my soapbox about that these days, because we're seeing them come out more and more and more. I have talked to people in states across the country, tiny little towns, major towns like Portland, who are experiencing terrible problems right now with militia activity. But it is across the country, and it is dangerous.
Thank you, Mary. I've been teaching and studying and talking about politics and elections in Pennsylvania and beyond for years, and I'm woefully unprepared to know some of the things that you just said. So I really appreciate that you shared it. I want to get to some questions. We have about, I'm just looking at time, less than a half hour. And we've had a lot of questions from people that registered for the event. And I have a ton that I'd like to ask, but I want to get to a few of those. So let me start. I like this first question. What can public officials do to ensure that the election integrity is viewed and addressed as a nonpartisan concern? I've heard that raised a couple of times from Watt. So David, I'll let you take that first.
Boy, yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, I think the undercurrent of this conversation is the partisan vitriol that we seem to be swimming in. It is one of those things. I was on a call today with the Secretary of State from Michigan, Jocelyn Benson, who is a really smart person of great integrity. We have to lift up people like that who are currently in office, who are out of office, and just to say, here's who we are and here's what we're doing, and I'll let you peek behind the curtain. By the way, the other antidote to that is just transparency. Election geek that I am, I found myself a few months ago watching the video that the folks in Denver, Colorado put together that takes you for a tour of their election processing operation. So there's the little Mrs. Jones with the basket of envelopes, and there's Herb over at the computer, and you think like, oh, okay, well, I don't see anybody in cloaks here, cloaks and daggers. So I think transparency goes a long way. We actually, in the spring, did a live stream camera on the processing operation in Philadelphia, which attracted like hundreds of people watching, even though it really was the equivalent of watching paint dry. I mean, there was nothing going on, but transparency is a great antidote to the kind of plots that people are spinning.
That's wonderful. Dick, you spoke a little bit before about your own efforts and putting together bipartisan coalitions. Care to elaborate on the question about how to ensure that this is viewed as a nonpartisan concern?
Yeah, I'm hoping that, just having the names that we have on this council will be of some help. And we, again, have a lot of former officials from different states, and they can be put in the media. And we're having when we do media, we're going to only have a Republican and a Democrat together. We're never going alone, so that people get the idea that this is truly nonpartisan. We are just trying to help have a valid election. And I want to reiterate what David just said. I think that's a great thing for us to focus on. Local TV stations in all over Pennsylvania could do stories on their election commission and their people that work, and they could, have them go through the place and do a show on it. I mean, little things like that can get across to people. This whole thing is opaque. I mean, Nobody knows how this all works. And
Well,
get all this disinformation that it's all rigged and everybody is cheating and the election officials are stupid and don't know what they're doing. And that's what they think.
yeah. There's a lot less drama there than people think there is. I mean,
absolutely.
If you're opening several 100,000 ballots, it's basically like watching a direct mail house. So, but that's what it is. That's the mechanics of how this stuff works.
Good. Mary, any thoughts on making it totally viewed, or at least more enhanced view of this as a nonpartisan issue?
I couldn't agree more. You've got to bring Republicans and Democrats together to be putting out that message just over and over. I mean, this should not be a partisan issue. Everyone should want to encourage people to vote and for their votes to count. And it's just a sad, time that we're in, that it has become partisan, at least to a certain extent. But I think in many ways, that's because of the current leadership that is actually fomenting some of that. And I do think there are plenty of elected officials, currents or formers, and even some currents on both sides of the aisles that would agree about this. My organization does a lot of criminal justice reform work in addition to many other types of constitutional litigation. And we've been very successful in bringing former and current Republican and democratically appointed and elected prosecutors together to sign lots and lots of amicus briefs in cases about criminal justice reform. We're talking about bail reform, fines and fees reform of prosecutorial misconduct rules, and juvenile life without parole. And that shows you that, for example, we've had briefs with the former Republican Attorney General Mike Mukasey and the very progressive Philadelphia District Attorney Larry Krasner signing the same brief, because despite their differences out here, there's this constellation of things that most prosecutors agree about, and that's the fairness of the criminal justice system and the importance of making sure that it appears fair. And of course, we know it's not fair in every place in this country. And so I feel like voting is the same thing. Regardless of your politics, there ought to be this place that we all can agree that everyone should have an opportunity to vote and have their vote counted. And, if you can't bring people across the aisle to agree to that, then I don't know what our democracy is about anymore, what this country was founded on.
Great. Thank you, Mary. I want to make sure I can get to as many questions as possible. The next one's more specific and detailed. What is the time limit, even during COVID, for states to certify their election results? Anybody want to take it?
I may be wrong, but I think it's like December 14th or something like that, under the counting.
So I'm pulling up my cheat sheet here.
I cede my time to Mary.
Yeah. So December 8th, as I indicated before, is this safe harbor deadline for states to resolve the disputes eternally concerning the appointment of electors. And it has to be pursuant to laws that were already enacted before Election Day. And if they are able to resolve their internal disputes pursuant to their own laws, they kind of have the safe harbor that the electoral slate that they put up will not be challenged. If they don't meet that, December 14th is the actual meeting of the Electoral College, and that's set by federal law, can be changed only by Congress. So that's the day that they meet and they cast their votes. And so that's where we could have a problem if there are multiple sets of electors going up. Then other dates that are just important, since I have my cheat sheet up here, is December 23rd is a deadline for the Senate and the archivists to receive the certification of these electoral votes that were rendered on December 14th. The new Congress is sworn in on December 3rd or January 3rd. That is set by Constitution, so they can't be changed other than by constitutional amendment. That new session of Congress meets on January 6th to open the electoral certificates from the states, consider any objections and resolve them under federal law, and count them. That is a date also set by federal law, so only can be changed by Congress. And then finally, and this is important, the end of the presidential term is January 20th, set by the Constitution, and can only be changed by constitutional amendment.
Very good. Thank you, Mary.
And Senator Rubio has a bill out there. It's in Congress now. I don't think it'll probably go anywhere, but it extends that safe harbor date, or maybe even the 14th date, out further.
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to happen.
All right. The next question is kind of a big question, and one that has been discussed in the popular press and discussions. What can be done if the president loses the election but refuses to leave office? Heard this question asked many times, but never heard a clear answer. Anybody want to take that one?
Well, I can jump in with one aspect of that, which is that all of our governmental apparatus, all of the authorities under each of the departments and agencies, and that includes our military, they answer to the president, and that means the duly elected president. So they would be violating federal law and abdicating their responsibilities to answer to somebody who has lost the election. So, regardless of what the president might say about losing, and it might, maybe if he were to lose, and his own challenges to legitimacy, once through whatever process, whether it's the courts or whatever other process, the decision is that he has lost. If that's the case, the entire apparatus of the federal government needs to be answered to the duly elected president. And I do believe in our institutions, even though we've had some degradation of them, I do believe that most government officials and the military certainly would answer to the duly elected president once that is, has been resolved.
Again, maybe I'm a delegate from the party, the naive party. I would like to hope and think that the political pressure would be so intense. I mean, I took some confidence maybe a month or so ago when the president was saying something about maybe we'll move the election date, and Mitch McConnell said, no, we're not. So I would like to think that, folks, if the outcome were clear and Donald Trump was holding his breath and crossing his arms and refusing to go, that the political pressure from members of Congress and Senate administration everywhere would be so intense that it just wouldn't happen.
Congressman Gephardt, do you want to weigh in on that?
No, I agree with what both Mary and David said. I mean, this would be totally out of bounds, and I think the institutions that are involved would hold. We've had some discussions at Keep Our Republic about
I think the congressman might have froze up with the internet connection, so hopefully we'll get Dick back in a second. I'll turn to a question more specifically to Pennsylvania. So what are the most significant concerns that you have regarding the election process in Pennsylvania, since we're hosting this event in Pennsylvania? And maybe David, your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about a number of them, and it's the challenges, the processing challenge, the administration challenges are going to be focused on the larger counties. And as you know, we have 67 of them, and not all of them are of the same size. But so Philadelphia County, the collar counties around Philadelphia, Allegheny County, Lehigh County, Northampton County, the larger counties. That and then one that we haven't talked about is there is still some possibility that the rules could change. The legislature could pass a bill that would somehow the governor would sign, or the court decision, the state Supreme Court decision, gets crosswalked, as we talked about earlier, into federal court, and all of a sudden we get a new set of rules 2 weeks from now or 3 weeks from now, and that'll cause a huge amount of disruption, not only in getting the right messages to voters, but also to the county officials. So, each one of them has a website that says, here's what you do, and here's the deadline for this and that. And if that were to be changed or overturned, in the next 2 or 3 weeks, I think that's just an invitation to more disruption and potentially chaos.
Thank you. Mary, any thoughts? I know we're bringing you in from Arlington to weigh in on Pennsylvania specifics, but anything that you're particularly either concerned or interested in terms of the Pennsylvania processes?
Now, I think we've hit on many of them. I agree with David that, the prospect for confusion because of uncertainty while things are in litigation or other decisions are being made could have dramatic impacts. And so I don't want anybody to be dissuaded from getting out and voting by anything that we're talking about tonight. And certainly also not by the prospects of political violence. I will say Pennsylvania is a place with a lot of active private unlawful militias. Some of you following the news there have probably seen some of their recent displays. And so that obviously also concerns me.
Hey, Chris, just to slip in for the Pennsylvanians that are watching this, a lot of questions about where's my mail ballot? And I know we get that a lot. The counties are now sending out their ballots, and you should, because they had to resolve a question with the Green Party candidate. And I would expect to see them, let's just say, next week.
Thank you so much, David. I've been getting that question a lot the last few days. And so it's great for anybody that's viewing from Pennsylvania to get that word. Congressman Gephardt, we have you back?
I hope so.
That's good. I wanted to make sure you had a chance to finish your thoughts. With the previous question, we kind of moved to some Pennsylvania specific topics, but we were talking about that kind of broad question regarding the president if he decided not to leave. And so I'd please give you an opportunity to weigh in on that.
It's just in agreement with Mary and David. I think institutions will hold. I think the military and so on is going to answer to whoever the president is at the time. And so I just don't see how that works if he tries to do that. I just don't believe it will work. So I have confidence we can do this, and I think that everybody will do what they're supposed to do.
Thank you so much. I have another question about just how clear the Constitution is on the process of electoral certification. Is there clarity? Again, I guess there's no constitutional lawyers. Mary, you will be our voice for folks in the legal profession. Is there clarity on the process of election certification?
Well, I mean, some of that is not in the Constitution. Some of that has been implemented through the Electoral Count Act, which is the act we were talking about earlier. And some of those deadlines that I mentioned when I was running through deadlines before come from the Electoral Count Act, and some of the procedures for resolving disputes come from the Electoral Count Act. What's clear in the Constitution are certain dates, such as the date of the transition of power and the date that Congress takes its seats, and also the Electoral College, of course, as the way that we, count votes is a constitutional provision. And so, for example, there are movements toward, what about a national popular vote? Well, right now, that would take a constitutional amendment unless all the states gather together. And there is a movement toward this to enter into a compact to pledge that they would pledge their electoral votes to the national popular winner. They would pledge their votes to that person in their state, as opposed to having a winner take all, which is what we have right now in a state by state situation. So that electoral college process is in the Constitution, but otherwise a lot of the details are left to federal law, and there is a gray area in that federal law.
Chris, I say this with some trepidation as a non-lawyer, but having read a few things and reread a few things, it also strikes me that a lot of the fine-grained detail about how each state reports its result and elects its electors is in their state constitutions, which vary widely. So that's where I think a lot of the action is going to be. Should it come down to, which slate of electors is going to be sent forth from Pennsylvania or Virginia or Florida or what have you. So that at the very least will keep both the political strategists and the lawyers busy.
Indeed. Congressman, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think if we get into that, it's going to be really tough to work through it. We've had some really good constitutional lawyers look at the Electoral Count Act, and as Mary said, it is really hard to understand what it really is saying, and it can be construed in many different ways. But there's a lot of work going on about that, and hopefully that will be published. We're going to try to get some of that out so that if this happens, there's a better understanding. But this is a real challenge to work through it. It's very unclear. It's subject to different interpretations that I'm sure lawyers will argue on both sides. So I just hope and pray we don't get into that mess.
There is a resource I could point the viewers to. So there is a national task force on election crises, which is a bipartisan task force. It includes election officials, former government officials, civil rights and civil liberties organizations, social media platforms, a whole variety of individuals, both Republican and Democrats, who have come together, and I'm part of that task force, in full disclosure, to talk about some of these difficult issues and to put out resources for the public. And you can get to their website at electiontaskforce.org. And then you can go to resources, which is where I was looking when I was looking at my other screen for the cheat sheet of those dates. And they have put out also a paper on the Electoral Count Act, which is the considered view of that group, although again, there is still wiggle room. So for some of these questions, I would commend your viewers to take a look at some of the resources, because that is the product of bipartisan consensus. And they're very particular about not putting out anything publicly unless well more than a majority, I think maybe 80% or something of all of us vote that we should be put out. And don't quote me on the 80%, but it's a way more than half have to say, yes, we should publish this resource.
Oh, fabulous, Mary. That's great. This is part of the evening that I was hoping for, to share some of this information. Last question, as we run out of time here. And it's a positive question looking forward. Moving into the next election cycles after this, if you could recommend one reform, a single reform that you think would have the biggest impact on American electoral processes, what would it be? And I'll start with you, Dick. Where would you start?
Well, what I'm going to say, I'm sure would be very controversial. I would get rid of the Electoral College. I truly believe that in a democracy, every vote should be equal. I understand why it got into the Constitution. That was part of making the deal. I get political deals. You got to do it to get the compromise. But if we keep having elections where the person elected does not have the national popular vote, it is going to be corrosive for the future of this country. And I think Mary was describing an effort that's been made state by state to get them to pass a state law that says that their electors will cast their vote for whoever won the national popular vote. I think about 10 states have passed that. Obviously, that doesn't affect anything until you get to 270.
Right.
But that to me is the one thing that should change. I know that's controversial. There'd be a lot of people who don't want that, but I just think democracy is democracy, and every vote has to be equal.
Great. I asked for one. He gave us one. David.
Well, this is a question that I think about, but don't often get to talk about, because most of my work is like yours, maybe, is focused on Pennsylvania. We've spent a lot of time on the gerrymandering issue and redistricting reform, which was, I think, addressed in a bill that the Democratic Congress put forth early in this Congress, HR 1, and there's different perspectives on sort of the root cause of some of the dysfunction that we have, but I think redistricting and gerrymandering belongs up there. And so modeling the efforts like California and Arizona, a lot of states have now moved to independent commissions. This doesn't help us necessarily on elections, but it helps. I think it could help the governing process and also sort of mute some of the partisan acrimony that we're bathed in these days.
Great. Thank you, Mary.
I mean, they've hit my top two. My number one is National Popular Vote. And Dick, I just pulled up their website, nationalpopularvote.com. It is up to 16 states now, which collectively represent 196 electoral votes. And these are states and big states. The bill will take effect only if enacted by enough states to be able to get, like you said, to 270, and then it would kick in. And that way you don't actually have to have a constitutional amendment, because this would be an agreement of states to pledge their electoral votes that way. Gerrymandering, I also agree, is an enormous problem. Redistricting, and I'm fully behind David's comments about the states that have moved to independent commissions. I know that can still be problematic because, they're still at some point going to, have politics involved, but it's far better than the systems we've had so far, which have been challenged over and over and over again. They've been struck down in many districts, have been struck down in many states by the courts, and then oftentimes, 2-3 times. And so it's ridiculous, and it needs to be fixed in a way that's fair. Again, the goal here, everybody's vote should count. Everyone should have the opportunity to vote.
That's great. I know we're spending most of our evening talking about this moment, right, and the questions that surround the process right now in Pennsylvania and in this election cycle. But I'm really happy we did have a few moments to talk about looking forward and possible reforms that could make the system better in terms of a lot of the measures that we hope for. Well, we are now past 7:40, so I'm going to use this chance to thank our panelists. First of all, David Thornburgh, Mary McCord, and Congressman Gephardt for their willingness to spend some time and talk about these issues tonight. As I said before, I do hope this is part of many conversations that are going on in the Commonwealth and beyond about processes right now. The more we can get informed, the more we can learn about these matters. I think it's the better as a citizenry as we approach this important election. I'd like to thank the folks at Keep Our Republic, Mark, Sean, who helped put all of the logistics together, and everybody there that was able to put this on. I'd like to thank Muhlenberg College, Chris Tadero, for helping spread the word. Hope, as I said before, many more of these events available. So thank you so much again to our panelists. Thanks for everybody that was tuning in tonight, and keep engaged and vote. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.